today, April 25th, 2014. Welcome to the University of North Texas, Professor Ussama Makdisi. We had a wonderful time at your lecture last night on sectarianism in the 19th century. And so I was thinking if you could, perhaps taking on that theme, tell us a bit more about the connections between U.S. history and the world of the United States as it's expanding in the 19th century and the Middle East. Some of these issues you touched upon in the lecture, and so if you could just expand on some of those broader connections.
Sure, thanks. It's nice to be here. Of course, as I mentioned yesterday in the lecture, the point of my work right now is to try to draw some parallels between the history of sectarianism as it emerges as a problem in the 19th century with to think about that history and juxtapose it with similar problems that emerged elsewhere in what I think of as the global 19th century. That is to say, questions of race relations in the US, questions of anti-Semitism in Europe, questions of communalism in South Asia, and questions of sectarianism in the Ottoman Empire. In all these instances, I think there were, especially as I did yesterday, juxtaposing the US and the Ottoman case, acknowledging that there are tremendous differences between these two histories. In both multi-ethnic, multi-religious societies, you had this extraordinary transformation in the 19th century from systems of discrimination towards systems of ostensible citizenship and presumed equality. And in both societies, there was extraordinary resistance, different kinds of resistance, and at the same time an embrace of this transformation.
And following up on that theme that you mentioned last night and that you just talked a bit more about, in terms of students of U.S. history today, 2014, in the United States, you talk a bit about the elements of that history, as you call it, the global 19th century, that would be essential for U.S. history students to understand the United States in a different or in a more complicated way. So you mentioned communalism, sectarianism. To what degree are these analogs of what is happening in the United States? How do students of the United States' history learn from these other processes?
Well, I think I firmly believe, of course, that students of history can learn and should learn from any number of different histories. And so the idea would be not necessarily to say these are all the same history, but in fact to learn from difference. And at the same time, to learn to make analogies, to make comparisons, even if every comparison ultimately will break down. There's no such thing as a perfect comparison or a seamless juxtaposition. But the idea would be to encourage students of U.S. history to think outside of what has been up until now, I feel, and not just I, but this has been a common a recognition among U.S. historians, an incredible insularity to the way U.S. history has been framed as a national story, as an exceptional story, as a story that has almost no relationship to what's happening in, for instance, South Asia or in the Middle East or in other parts of the world, because the comparison that is to be made is going to be between Europe and the U.S., if there is a comparison that's going to be made, and not between the U.S. and other societies. But in the end, peoples around the world were struggling with the question of citizenship and equality and science in the 19th century, and these were universal questions. So why not push the comparison? So I would encourage students of U.S. history to, in fact, explore and think about and see what's similar, what's different, and how does juxtaposing, as opposed to pushing a comparison, but juxtaposing, saying this is different, this is two different cases, put them together, what resonates, what makes sense, what inspires us to think about these cases in different ways by bringing together histories and historiographies that people have not been exposed to. I mean, we won't know until we do it, is the point. I mean, there's no necessary, I mean, it's not that I think that there will be one outcome in this juxtaposition, but by at least forcing the juxtaposition, I think we can learn a lot.
On that note, for students who are interested in a field that today I think is called U.S. in the World, and of course that title is a product of various ideological developments throughout the 20th, 21st century.
I wonder where the U.S. was before.
Right, right. Now it has entered into the world. But for students who are interested in pursuing that question, who are trained in U.S. history, what would you say would be the kinds of topics and directions that would be fruitful for students interested in that topic?
I think the first and foremost, the prerequisite is, of course, to take the world, whatever part of the world we're thinking of, seriously, which means not just linguistic competence in whatever part of the world we happen to be working on, but also the idea of historiographical depth and reading, so that you actually, the historian or the student, immerses himself or herself in the historiographic conditions that you've been asking about. So that we're not always looking at it from, so the U.S. and the world is not always, as I see it now, the problem now is that it's still U.S.-centric. And the U.S. and the world is still part of U.S., it has been an extension of U.S. historiography, and it's, so I think that to me is the biggest task and the challenge, to get people who are working on the U.S. and X to take that X seriously, and the first step is to actually really understand, grapple with the languages, the histories, the historiographies of that part of the world, so that the questions are not just emerging from a U.S. historiography, but are emerging from some other places as well. I think that to me is an essential first step. Otherwise, it'll just be essentially U.S. history, yet again, U.S. history and U.S.-centric.
Mm-hmm. And what do you see as the relationship between the power of the United States globally and the developments in these changes of how U.S. history is understood internally to the United States, with fluctuating roles of the United States and the rest of the world? Do you see that this field may transform in different ways? What would you say about that?
Yeah, again, it's hard to predict in the future, but I suspect as U.S. power declines, economic power, political power declines from where it was in the 50s and 60s to where it seems to be heading, I think it's going to possibly open up the field of the U.S. and the world even more so than it has been. But I think, I mean, in a sense, the task remains the same, and the basics of prerequisites remain the same for historians who want to study the U.S. encounters with any part of the world, or juxtaposing U.S. history with other histories. The prerequisites are still there. You still need to take that other historiography seriously, those other sort of places and spaces seriously, which means that it cannot just be about American actors. It also means looking at the trajectories that don't involve America in those other parts of the world, whether it's the Middle East or South Asia or Latin America or Africa, China, Japan. It doesn't really matter.
Great. Anything else you'd like to share for the UNT community?
Nothing more than what we've been talking about.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you very much. I think we'll end it there.